Good morning. My name is Mark Denham. I'm an SE manager here at Zerto, and with me today is Kyle Abisher, who is one of our senior sales engineers, and would like to welcome you today to the first episode of IT Uninterrupted from Zerto. We'll wait a couple of minutes and then we'll do our introductions and get started. All right, let's go ahead and get going. Again, welcome. My name's Mark Denham. I've been with Zerto for about 3 years, but have worked in the IT industry for over 30. Have spent much of that time at the beginning working within IT, where I had some experiences with disaster recovery, with moving of data centers, as well as general infrastructure. And then I spent almost 20 years with EMC, where obviously in the products we sold there had a lot of experience dealing with disaster recovery teams, data mobility and things that you get into when you're building data centers, to support DR. With me today also is Kyle Abisher, and Kyle, I'll pass it over to you for an introduction.
Thanks, Mark. Kyle Abisher, been in the industry for a good 25 years. Started my career in software development and then moved into infrastructure, and I've been in the cloud data center type of framework for over 15 years. Came from CSC, which is now DXC Technologies, managing 8 data centers and cloud data centers in their mix. And then I've been with Zerto for going on 3.5 years, and really excited to share some knowledge with you or what we've learned in the past in data center DR activity and preparing for those.
All right, thanks, Kyle. So to start off looking at the agenda for today, we'll start off by talking a little bit about the DR planning process, how to make decisions about where you want to position, where you want to replicate to for failover and disaster scenarios. We'll talk about the way some of the technologies have changed, which have changed some of the decisions we need to make and options that we have for disaster recovery data centers. After that, I'll kind of hand it over to Kyle, and he's going to talk about assessing the current environment, doing capacity planning for that target data center. Some of the things that have changed from a testing perspective, the way that's kind of evolved in the last few years, and then a little bit about some of the evolving technologies that have really enabled us to approach the way we do disaster recovery different in this new world that we live in. Obviously today, all businesses are online, all applications are important, and it's really changed the way that we need to step back and look at DR and planning for DR. So hopefully as we go through this, it'll make sense and you'll learn something from it. So the first thing is just kind of an introduction. There are a lot of IT imperatives out there that anybody that works in this industry is dealing with every day. Obviously, cloud has really changed the way we look at IT, and it's really been driven by the fact that we now live in this digital world where everything's online. Within that cloud environment, security is more important than ever. We need to secure data. We need to make sure the right people are accessing that data. But we're also in a world that's very connected, so it's really increased a lot of the challenges there. Compliance, obviously, government regulation, compliance around whether it's healthcare data or other types of data, is more important than ever. And obviously, the number of regulations we're dealing with seems to continue to grow given this new cloud world that we live in. We all know how data is growing. We've seen a lot of the statistics published the last few years around that, and technology continues to change. So we're always evolving what technologies we're using, how we're using them, so that we can provide applications that are more responsive to the business. The flip side of that is, downtime is unacceptable today. again, in this digital global world that we live in, applications really need to be up 24/7. Any amount of downtime or data loss is going to cost the business time, money. So it really puts a lot of pressure, and I'm sure a lot of you out there working in the space feel this every day. So there's a lot changing, but I still have that requirement for 24/7. So if we kind of look at, what are some of the things that can disrupt IT infrastructures, applications, and hence the business, there's a wide breadth of things we must think about. There's what we refer to unplanned outages, which I think is the thing we've, often thought about when we talk about disaster recovery. Whether it's a weather event, a power outage, whatever it may be that's going to impact the IT operation. That's what we kind of think about, that disaster recovery. There's also planned outages, again, as technology evolves, as we integrate new infrastructure technologies as well as application technologies. There are things that can interrupt the business, but again, we're still in that 24/7 world. For this discussion today, we're going to focus kind of on that DR, on the disaster recovery in the unplanned space. So where do we begin when we start thinking about disaster recovery planning? Number one, you see, a lot of times people think about, okay, what is my infrastructure? How do I replicate it somewhere else? But that's really going to be the second step. The first thing we have to do is really think about the overall business. So it has to start with a business continuity plan. So that assessment of what are my key business processes? What are the applications that are required to support those processes? And then once I define that, prioritize that, understand, the amount of time I could really afford to be without those processes. These are the kind of requirements that are going to drive what we do within IT. So we're business process driven. The next thing we have to think about is, what am I protecting against? I know in my travels, in my different roles, I've dealt with a lot of customers that may have two data centers within the same building, on the same campus, or within the same city. And depending on what you're protecting against, this may be good enough. But as you think about where we are today, and I know I manage kind of the Southeast territory where, along the coast where hurricanes are a big threat, and they can affect a broad area. So you have to think about, again, not only what is it I'm protecting within the business, what is the thing that could happen that could cause the outage? I mentioned the application priorities. Depending on the priority of the business processes and what needs to be up at what time, you're going to prioritize those applications, and that's going to drive the strategy that you develop. And that strategy is going to include which applications come up first. Am I going to recover into a second data center that I own, so an on-premise data center? Can I go to cloud? Or do I have some kind of a hybrid strategy, which may have some of both? Then I have to look at, okay, what are the application requirements? What is the technology required to support that plan? But then also I'm going to have to look at the cost factors. So I have to validate kind of the ecosystem of options that I have and pick a specific strategy based on, both these types of requirements. Then I'm going to document my recovery plan, my run books to make sure I can execute. And then I want to continuously improve. And Kyle will talk some later kind of about testing. But this is one thing that I know we see today. There's a lot of people really evolving how they test disaster recovery. So how has DR evolved? And like I said, I'm kind of a dinosaur. I've been around for a while. And if I think back to my earliest encounters in the space, we're really looking at a few critical applications. We're primarily looking at 9 to 5 interactions with customers. And, those were the days where, if you think about just general backups, it was, you could do them at night. You had backup windows that might last 6 or 8 hours when you could get daily backups of data. And then as part of the DR process, that was key to be able to take tapes, ship them somewhere else. But at the end of the day, there was more tolerance for downtime based upon the Today's more global nature of the business versus then, and just the importance of the applications and running every piece of the business. Where we are now, as I've already alluded to, more of the applications are important and critical. Customers are expecting that 24/7 experience. Applications are the business. There's very few businesses today that can operate if they don't have their key applications or all their applications up and running. And then image is everything. And this is something we hear if you think about it from a disaster recovery perspective, whether it's some kind of environmental outage or whatever, or if it's a type like a ransomware attack. Again, if you look at the news every day, you see businesses that are being hit. So image is very important for a business, and making sure that you have, a process that's going to work, a plan that you've tested, and you're going to be able to react and keep the business up and running when the disaster occurs. Now let's take a little bit, let's kind of take a walk through history here. If you think about the traditional ecosystems, and I kind of alluded to this earlier. I know when I first started in the industry, we had nightly backups to usually to tape. We had the Chevy truck method of replication, where we might take those high-end applications, take the tapes, ship them somewhere else. I think most of us that have been around a long time, there's companies out there that have been in business for decades, just having secondary data centers with highly leveraged infrastructures, and you would contact, for maybe once or twice a year to do a planned DR test. And when I would do the test, I would have a cold site. I would have to go restore data, bring applications up, and then do some type of kind of pre-planned limited testing. But I don't think a lot of people had a lot of confidence that, if I really had an outage, and especially if it was large scale, hitting a lot of different businesses, are we really going to have the ability to come and recover? Kind of the next evolution of that was when we got more real-time replication of data. And again, in this space, maybe those top tier applications now migrate to, real-time replication into some type of warm site, so that you could have somewhat of a restart capability. The data's already there, sitting on disk, and it would be a matter of how do I restart applications, swing networks over for those high tier applications or the low tier, whichever way you look at it, tier 1, tier 2. But then some of the other lower tiers, I might still, continue to use the traditional backup. And depending on where they fit in the recovery plan, it will say I fell over for a few weeks. Some of the lower tier applications you might not worry about, but you live with the higher. But again, it was just kind of that next evolution of where we were from a DR ecosystem perspective. So this slide is really to kind of represent where we are today. There's a lot more options out there. I know we see a lot of customers still have multiple data centers or may go into a colo, but still more of a dedicated infrastructure, for their DR capability. We see, we have the ability to do live replication with short recovery point objectives for a much larger percentage of the environment. But we still see a lot of people that for that on-prem data center, they may still have the tier 1, tier 2, but in the past, they have not really had DR for the lower tier applications. So a lot of them are now starting to look at shared infrastructures as a possible target for that second site. So we'll see a lot of companies that may maintain that primary on-premise data center for top tier, the higher tier applications, but now they can look at things like into public cloud, so Azure, AWS, Google, or also there's just a vast array of managed service providers out there that will provide, not only a target for your DR data center where you want to recover to, but also a vast array of services, all the way up to a white glove service where they'll manage this process for you. So again, a lot of different options away, different price points, different capabilities. And so the next step is, okay, how do you start to look at the options that you have and figure out what your next steps need to be? And this is what I'll refer to more as the recovery strategy. So when I think about that strategy, the first thing is, okay, where is my primary site? I talked earlier about what are the types of risks that I want to protect against, the type of events that could take my business down that I want to protect against. And then I think about where do I need to recover to? Is it to a local site? I've seen businesses like, for example, in manufacturing, I think we see a lot of examples where we may have large manufacturing facilities or campuses, and there will be recovery data centers on the same campus, but as far away as they can get from each other. And I think in this case, if these are systems that are managing a production line, if there's some type of outage that takes this facility down, then you may keep the systems up, but if I can't run a production line or manufacturing, is that going to be of value? So in that example, I think we see a lot of manufacturing to take that approach today. But again, if it's going to be something where that proximity to the site is not as important, where that recovery site could be, geographically moved. So if I'm in Florida, concerned about a hurricane, get out of the state, get away from the region where that's a threat, or potentially into the cloud. So think about, what is the business process? What's that recovery site? The next thing is, what is the minimum critical equipment that I need? Again, if it's an application that I need up and running in minutes or hours, I'm probably I need that equipment pre-staged, warm, running, data replicated there, ready to just restart application. If it's something that maybe I can wait, a few weeks, and if it's a longer term disaster, I could drop ship equipment in. Think about that. What is that minimum equipment I need on site? Next, what is the required data? What's the method that I get it there? What's my recovery point objective? So in the case of an outage, how much data can I really afford to lose? And then this also plays into number 4, which is network connectivity. Where am I going from my disaster site to my recovery site? How much data is changing every day? How much do I need to replicate? And then also from a network connectivity, where are my users coming in from? Are they coming over the internet? Is it a case where I have a corporate site, but in the case of disaster, people may be at home? This is obviously something that we've seen, over the last few months with COVID, where we've had, large groups of people that have gone home to work. And it's put a lot of pressure on companies to think through not only what are the technologies that I'm using to enable that access, but what is the bandwidth that's in place from home networks. Think about the security. If I'm within a single site going into a data center, I don't have as many security risks as if I have people maybe coming in from home systems over the network. So again, just some of the key things that you really need to think about as you put this overall strategy together. And then, the key things that are driving the decisions, like anything else in IT, it's going to come down to, I have the financial, so what is the cost going to be to get a certain level of RPO, RTO, functionality, availability, and then I can look at it from the technical side and say, well, to run the application, how am I going to get my best performance, my best uptime, what kind of capacity am I going to need? And I think, something that I've talked about a lot and in, discussions, both, working in IT and then on the vendor side, discussions around if I just started with a pure technical requirement and didn't take into consideration cost, it would obviously be, a Cadillac system that I would go build, or maybe today a Tesla system that I would go build. But again, when we take into considerations, this is being driven out of a business continuity plan. And if I look at it from a business perspective and, the cost factors there, it's going to be a balance between these two sides to really come to what is the optimal solution and strategy that I need to support my business. So now let's talk about, I mentioned in the previous slide where I looked at the current ecosystems and what the possibilities are. Let's think about what those options are and the benefits and why you would choose certain things. And you can probably hear my dogs, one of the joys of working from home. So first, let's talk about kind of that on-prem. Like I said, this is probably a more traditional thing that we've seen. And, for some people, this still fits into this strategy. So what are some of the benefits of an on-prem recovery data center? Control, the fact that it's in my four walls. If I look at it from security, regulatory, it's going to make it more manageable from that perspective. Performance, it could be the network proximity. What kind of bandwidth do I have into this data center? Do I have workers that are located there? I might want to leverage investments. I already have an investment in the data center. I'm contractually committed to release, or I may own it for some period of time. So since I already have that investment, cost may drive that. Yeah, that's the best place for me. Also, we see a lot of people that will, take equipment like, current production equipment, when they replace it, move it to the DR site. So again, if I've already got that equipment, and it makes sense financially, that might be the right answer to do it on-prem. And then this concept of the 3-2-1 rule, basically that I've got copies of data on-site, off-site to be able to recover from. So by having two different data centers, they may be on-prem, but separated based on the requirements that I've looked at. These are some of the factors that can make on-prem a good option. So when I look at one, I want to choose it again: business regulatory drivers, performance and control, leverage existing equipment or data center investments. And then the other thing here is predictable cost. And in a minute, when I talk about cloud, you'll look at the ability to scale and burst when you have to. But a lot of times people run into issues with cost. They're not, okay, if I'm going to be able to scale, be able to burst, then I get a surprise bill at the end of the day. So, with this, you're probably in an on-prem, you're going to have a more predictable cost model as compared to more of an OpEx type model. So next, we'll look at the benefits of DR in IaaS, or infrastructure as a service. So this would be the case as an example, say going into one of the hyperscalers and leveraging their native virtualization technology. Obviously, in these cases, you're going into a shared environment. And so, there's going to be some advantage to that. Number one, if I want to move toward OpEx, the fact that I can pay as I go, as I use those resources. I don't have to provide maintenance on the equipment. The hyperscaler, the provider, is going to provide that. So I don't have to think about maintenance costs of equipment or labor. Again, scale. They've made large investments and have a lot of resources available in the data center, and they've made it very easy to scale and grow as you need to under the OpEx model, pay as you go. Again, the positive of being able to scale. A negative could be, gee, I wasn't expecting a bill of that size at the end of the month. Reliability, again, a lot of equipment deployed, there's failures, the ability to move, and they also, again, provide that offsite storage of your data. So again, that's the DR into infrastructure service, so kind of, you think going into a hyperscaler on their native technology. So when do I want to do it? Again, cost and scalability are priorities, especially if I'm looking at OpEx. Another thing you can get from these hyperscalers, from the IaaS, is the ability to leverage things like DevOps technologies and containers and other things that could supplement the environment. Again, you've got a lot more of these PaaS type services that are out there within the hyperscalers. And then also, I think with this, when you go into this environment, you're still going to run your own DR testing. So in infrastructure service, you have access to deploy, your basic infrastructure, have somebody else maintain that, but then you're going to manage it. You're going to manage your applications. You're going to manage your, your recovery environment. And so when it comes to testing, you're still going to be performing that testing. So it's something that you can do. The next one I'll look at real quick is something that's come out in the last couple of years, this concept of running VMware on IaaS. So I think the major hyperscalers have this capability now. Google, I think, is just getting theirs up and running. But some of the advantages to this are, number one, if you have a strong investment in VMware and you want to continue to run native applications on VMware, your people are trained in it, you have policies, configurations in place, and there's not going to be a lot of change. You're still going to get the benefits of IaaS in that you're running on top of somebody else's environments, providing the services and the maintenance, at that lower level. But on top and operationally, you're still dealing with VMware. The other thing here is, when you run VMware on IaaS, you're really getting a private cloud environment that's supported by the hyperscalers through their IaaS service. So again, this can be maybe a little more costly, but there are also a lot of advantages to go in this direction. And so, for that, when do I make the decision? I'm looking for some of those advantages of IaaS from a perspective of maintenance and support. Again, I want that private, dedicated cloud environment. Just leveraging the investment I've made in VMware, that can be in training, can be in policies, configurations, no changes to applications. And, there's just a lot of, it's interesting. I've been at Zerto about 3 years, and we've had capabilities, I know, with public cloud. But it's amazing just in the last 3 years how many customers that you're talking to have a cloud initiative. And most of them have a cloud-first initiative. So it's something people are looking at. And this is a way, if you can, you can reduce costs by leveraging cloud, stay with VMware, but maybe close the data center, can be a lot of advantage there. So again, the third option you really look at as a target site. And then finally, the last one we'll look at is DR as a service. And this is where you're going out, it's going to be an OpEx model, and you're going to be paying a managed service provider that's going to provide that site, going to support you into the process. So they're going to have resources that are subject matter experts as far as doing business continuance, disaster recovery, as far as the implementation, supporting you in migrating your data into that environment. Being able to customize the services. I've seen with MSPs that I've worked with, all the way from a very minimal service where they may help you get up and running, provide you access to the environment, but then you manage your environment, your testing, within their infrastructure, all the way to more of a white glove service where they're actually going to run your DR tests for you and, provide things that you might not have the staff to do. And again, this is going to be also offered in an OpEx model. So just another option to consider. And again, kind of summarizing, this part of the presentation, this space, as the world has changed, we've gone to a more digital environment, digital applications, supporting very different business models, but technology's also evolved. So there's a lot more options out there, and hopefully kind of at the high level, this is giving you some things to think about as you make these decisions and kind of put your high level strategy together. Actually, DRaaS, I skipped my last slide, but again, some of the advantages of DRaaS, if you've got limited technical personnel, you can get that higher end service provider. They can give you that business continuity DR process support. The ones that I know that I've dealt with are very good at security and helping people that are moving to a kind of that shared model, being able to provide the security requirements around that. Dedicated resource, 7x24. So again, some of the things you need to think about if this fits you, thinking about doing disaster recovery as a service. And with that, since I've already done my summary, I'm going to turn it over to Kyle Abisher, who's going to dig a little deeper into, once you get in the data center, how do you decide how to implement there? So with that, Kyle, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Mark. Well, how do we get there? That's the big question, to everybody's mind is what are the steps that I need to take to assess my environment and whatnot. So We're going to first dive into how do I assess my current environment and deal with how to understand applications. So typically when you have applications in your environment, you have to understand the dependencies. What dependencies are they on? Typically, we depend on Active Directory. Most applications depend on DNS. How is DNS going to be managed as you move over into the cloud or your second location? Understanding what applications are doing batch processing and sending files to maybe a mainframe or mid-range, or how are they communicating via other mechanisms. I've seen applications that have FTP processes, or they may communicate differently by sending information to target locations. You also have to understand what applications communicate outbound to web entities. Maybe you have applications that send information out to a third-party vendor. So you have to understand those dependencies as well, and understanding infrastructure dependencies around load balancing, firewall, and all those, and how are your databases designed? Are they designed in a manner where you have a database for each application, or do you have a hub and spoke design, which all databases feed into a centralized database service set framework, which then you have to treat, how will you move that database over into your environment a little differently than if it's as clean as a one database per application scenario. And also understanding your tiers, right? Your tiers and what those represent. We talk about tiers of restoration. Typically in the legacy environment, the old school, you'd see minutes, hours of RPOs, snapshots and whatnot going on, and your backup 12-hour or 24-hour RTOs in your legacy type of scenario. But today's world, now that we have your iPhone and different technologies that potentially just drive immediate response type of actions from your customers, they're expecting RPOs in seconds and RTOs in minutes. They're expecting your systems to be up 24/7. So that's driving the different top tier, mid tier, and low tier requirements for a new technology DR capability. So when you're diving in and assessing that, we talk about some ancillary things like AD, DNS, but really understanding the infrastructure, what firewall rules are put in place for specific applications, who's talking to who, application load balancers, middleware web servers who are communicating, and what iRules are in place. Do you have file servers in the mix or index servers? And like I said, database servers that are designed a specific way when you're doing DR and restoration capabilities, and what you have to do to bring those apps up in the target location. Also, we see VMs, but what are the external systems? You may have mainframes or mid-range IAX, and what impact those have when you restore these into your second tier data center, and what things you have to put in place to make those things happen. We also have to consider capacity planning. Some people don't think about this. The typical standard is, yeah, let's use our legacy systems and legacy storage, move that all over to the second tier second tier data center, and start using new equipment here in the primary as a refresh. And that's all fine and good, but typically you got to put in consideration, do you have the capacity to handle your production workloads as it grows in these legacy storage and compute environments on the target side. So you got to keep in mind IOPS matters through the data pipe, the network pipe, how many systems are available to service these VMs or service the IAX or mainframe, the size of the storage requirements needed, and the performance requirements of that storage. So here's what what's the bandwidth? What type of pipe are you going to have between the two locations? Do you have enough pipe to basically feed not only the replication going over to the location, but what the change rate that is continuously changing as replication goes on. Also, what does the capacity look like? I have had customers be in a situation where they're using legacy systems over at the recovery site that cannot match or meet up with what is currently in production. So they have to plan accordingly on which apps are totally critical to have online, and then bring in hardware within their DR strategy to expand the environment as needed during a DR event, and to provide more compute to the environment to start spinning up the other applications. Also, storage performance. Can your applications be serviced out of the storage? Can the storage perform it well under the conditions? So if you have solid state in your production environment and you have spinning disks on the recovery side, does your IOPS footprint that services the applications in production, will they be able to meet the requirements in the recovery side of the house? So those are things you got to consider when dealing with capacity and understanding, will this work coming online? And how now that we hit into how to test, what does testing look like? That's a critical component, and typically in my experience, sometimes shops will say we got to test everything. Well, sometimes you get in a scenario where, okay, we're planning to take the whole data center and try to bring it up on the second tier, second data center. How's that going to work? And a lot of people get frozen in the moment of not wanting to do it because it's so impactful to the business to do that type of testing. So in today's technology, a lot of people are going into isolated testing mode, where they do applications and kind of groups of applications to do testing throughout the year of specific applications. And that gives them the capability to do that isolated testing without the full impact of the whole data center having to move at any given time. So that's kind of the evolving measures we see as far as testing. Some of the things, non-disruptive, building a test bubble network and on-prem, and giving the capability to move those workloads in that isolated area, and doing non-disruptive bubble testing in the cloud, and giving that. We're seeing that activity happening in the new way of doing testing. And basically really looking at a holistic way of doing testing without that old adage of taking a full weekend out with your team and taking a full weekend outage, whatnot, as far as doing a test. We're seeing where customers isolate their networks, fail over VMs and production workload or a physical workloads into isolated networks, and bringing them up, bringing a a replica of their AD in that isolated network and their DNS and everything being serviced out of the isolated network, and allowing for teams to do testing during the week or business hours, because you're not shutting down prod to do isolated testing. And I've seen customers, be very creative in bringing in, VPN tunnels specific to those isolated networks, bringing their app teams and doing that isolated and being really at the leading edge of doing non-disruptive testing while production is still online. So the evolving technologies we're seeing, we see, snapshot technologies and CDP for replication. Snapshots are, however you got them set up, they could be anywhere from 15 minutes to 4 hours to 6 hours. And then continuous data protection architectures are basically anytime data changes, they're immediately sent over to the target side house and realized in a journal type of scenario. We also see application consistency around replication, where VMs within a particular application, they typically, when you bring them up in the DR side, they have to all come up at a particular checkpoint where they're consistent. If you don't, you could get in a scenario where you have different RPOs for different systems within the app, which impacts the ability of the app to come into full service. I've seen multiple occurrences where, development teams have to recreate data or do some things to get the application to fully service because they didn't have their last known good backup was of 12 hours ago or 24 hours ago, and they had to recreate things on their systems to come to full serviceability. We also have array-based versus hypervisor-based replication going on for DR or IT resilient capability, where array-based, you're typically hooked into a like-for-like array configuration, where hypervisor allows you more flexibility, because at the hypervisor level, you're really pointing to maybe a data store capability, and it doesn't really matter what storage unit you have behind that virtualization framework. And in the world of kind of DR resiliency and data being able to get data back is basically that whole conglomerate of backups, replication, multiple tools involved to orchestrate and whatnot. And where we see the industry going now is, converging those aspects into one, where you can automate things coming up online, you can replicate as well, and you can also service backup restoration capabilities all in kind of a single platform. That's where we see the industry going. So to wrap it up, kind of your desired outcomes of the today's DR and IT resilient capability is, you want a peace of mind. You want to know it works. You want to be able to test it as many times as possible within a year time and audit that capability. You also want to deliver an insurance, delivering on that reliable insurance policy, making sure it works and confident that it will work. And you want to avoid the scenario where you're kind of building these snowflakes of scripts and whatnot that only one individual knows, because in that scenario, that if that individual either moves on or cannot, it doesn't stay with the company, that is an exposure of risk. So you want the capability to have all this tied into an automated resilient platform for the future that gives you the capability to move into cloud, move your environments to MSPs, and maybe a mixed mode scenario for your data restoration, IT resiliency framework. And with that, I will conclude that that is where we see data DR, the data center DR capability going. And thank you for coming and joining us on this journey into the new data center DR.